Okay. I'm very excited to be able to introduce to you Paula Jameson, who's going to talk about C.J. Thompson. But I first would like to begin the meeting, the gathering, with the Women's Prayer, which was written in 1980 by Joanna Gillespie, who was one of the co-founders of this institution, this gathering. Charlie, do you have that? Here we go. O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of the countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sewing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in this procession of praise, offering our very gifts and voices together with them, and Mary, the mother of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Yeah. The Episcopal Women's History Project's focus is on remembering and telling the stories of women who have, some who are famous, some who are little known, but we want to gather and remember the stories. And that's what I think is happening with this series. And I just want to put in an additional plug to all of you. If you've got a story of some woman who you think is really important to remember, please send it on to us, because we want to collect them and continue to spotlight them. So today our speaker is Paula Whitfield Jameson. She has a BA in history from the University of Texas in Austin and a master in psychology from West Texas University. Trained in oral history taking, listening skills, spiritual direction, Paula also does guest speaking and leads retreats. She actively volunteers with Women's Storybook Project of Texas, which works with moms in Texas prisons to stay connected to their children. She's just recently retired her business, Tell Me Your Story, where she documented individuals' life stories. Paula and her husband live in Austin and have 2 sons, Sterling and Marcus, and 2 grandchildren. I will now turn this over to Paula, who's going to tell us all about C.J. Thompson.
All right, thank you. Let me get my screen sharing here going. There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Wherever you are, all over the United States. I have a really fun, unusual story to share with you today. It is truly a pioneer story of a woman who actually doesn't go by C.J. Tompkins. She was born Carlotta or Charlotte Tompkins, so I will be referring to her by her name, Charlotte Tompkins. Her life story sounds like something out of an Old West novel, and yet it is a very true story. I've discovered over the years working with documenting people's life stories that there is nothing that is more interesting than a true story. No made-up story is as good. So the thing that I was so stunned about when I ran across Charlotte's story, just to give you a tiny bit of background, because she's not, probably nobody's heard of her. I was doing research on my family background, and my mother grew up in a little town named Albany, Texas, in far west Texas, west of Fort Worth. And I had known about a little bit about Charlotte Tompkins, but didn't realize until I read a book on her that she was a cradle-born Episcopalian and that she had done quite a bit for her Episcopal church, which I will tell you about in the story. And I was just stunned. And I will tell you, when you hear her story, you will understand why I was so stunned when I discovered that she was an Episcopalian and had contributed quite a lot. The other thing that really catches me about sharing Charlotte's story with you all today is that her story is very much a biblical story. It's a messy story, and human beings, as we know, are messy. We all have messiness in our lives. Her story is full of contradictions, good and bad decisions. She is very much a victim of her time in history, yet she never gave up having faith and maintaining her dignity all through life and believing that God had good things ahead for her. So her decisions were very similar to a lot of the women. When I think about the women's stories in the Bible, for example, when you think about it in context of their time, Abraham's Sarah allowed herself to be trafficked twice by her husband to save his own skin. We don't think about it in that context, but that's what we would think about it today. And also, Sarah was so jealous of Hagar and, ran Hagar off with her husband's firstborn son. Rebecca schemed against her husband Isaac to have her favored son Jacob receive his father's blessings over Esau. And of course, Leah deceived Jacob when she followed her father's directives and went in to be with Jacob, pretending to be her sister Rachel. Basically, she was seducing a newly married man. So all of these stories, we have so many biblical stories that are messy, and yet God works through our messiness. That is what life is all about. And we are certainly hoping that God is working through the messiness right now in Ukraine. There's always something that we can watch to see what God is doing in his greater story. So in thinking about all of that, let's start our story on Charlotte Tompkins. She was born in 1844, 17 years prior to the Civil War, in Warsaw, Kentucky. And I have a map of Kentucky up here. And the reason I do is because I knew nothing about Kentucky. Being from Texas, I wasn't even sure what states bordered Kentucky. I'm embarrassed to say, but I certainly didn't know where Warsaw was. So I assume some of you all don't too. And it's kind of fun, just helps me place somebody in time. If you look at Lexington right here, the red star, Frankfurt, the red star. If you just shoot straight up north, just about right here, if you can see my arrow, that's the Ohio River that runs all down here, the border of Kentucky, which I didn't know that either. And so she was born up in this area. She was born April 21st, 1844, just outside of Warsaw, to a very wealthy, upper class Episcopalian family, Kentucky family that owned a small plantation. Let me show you if I can get my arrows here. There we go. This is not her home, but it is very much like probably type of home that she lived in or that her family owned, kind of a small to medium sized plantation home. That one's actually located right near Warsaw, Kentucky. So that was basically what her home looked like. She only had one sibling. She had a younger sister who she adored. So she was the oldest child. And her father adored her. And he really gained all of his wealth, not from the plantation. They had really just a handful of slaves and raised tobacco and hemp. But his wealth all came from owning and selling racehorses down in New Orleans. And also he was an upper class, very professional gambler. And so he gambled a lot. And back in those days, gambling was considered very much a good vocation for raising money, just kind of like playing the stock market is today. The upper class gambled quite a bit. So at any rate, Charlotte attended an Episcopal girls' convent school where she gained a really strong academic career, as well as she was steeped in Bible studies and in Hebrew. They taught the Hebrew language. And then, of course, along with her education and her Bible studies, she learned a lot of the acceptable standards of ladylike comportment for her upper class upbringing. Let me show you a picture of, this is basically what Charlotte looks like at about 17 years old, right when the Civil War began. Her father, again, she was the oldest and favored daughter. And after she completed school, he took her, and I don't know what age she would have been, maybe 15, something like that, because he took her on trips all over Europe with him, to the upper class gambling establishments, and he taught her how to gamble. He taught her all the nuances of looking at faces and looking at people's body language, all of those things. He taught her how to play cards honestly. And of course, the term back then was flipping the paste boards. It was one of the terms they used for that. But at any rate, he took her all over Europe, so she was very well traveled. And then he took her down to New Orleans with him a lot. One thing I forgot to mention is that Charlotte and her sister both had their own personal slave, which is not particularly unusual for back then. Her slave, though, was unusual. Her slave was also her companion. Her name was Mary Poindexter. I wish I had a picture of her. They said that she was almost 7 feet tall, very dark in skin color, very intimidating, and was very faithful to Charlotte and could protect her beautifully, and did so quite a few years. So Mary always traveled with Charlotte all over Europe, down to New Orleans. They took quite a few trips down to New Orleans with her father. And they said the interesting thing was that there was an 8 p.m. curfew in New Orleans at that time for women, children, and slaves who could not be out on the streets after 8 p.m. So her father probably gambled all evening while she was sequestered to her hotel room. But they did say that she snuck away some and went down where the horse stables were and practiced her gambling skills with some of her dad's jockeys. And so that's where she got to actually test out how good a gambler she was. People, in writing about her history, some people believe, and this is just their supposition, that due to the nature of the times and how unsettling it was right prior to the Civil War, that probably Charlotte's father realized that she was going to be the one that would take over all his enterprises and would have to support the plantation and her mother and her sister. And so he wanted to, since he didn't have a son, so he wanted to make sure that she had a way to economically survive. And so there was a sense that he taught her these upper class, in the upper class genteel gambling houses, that he taught her how to gamble so that she would be able to take over all the responsibilities someday when he was no longer around. At the start of the Civil War, of course, in 1861, Kentucky ended up being occupied very early on and very quickly by the Union forces. So Kentucky is a Union state. However, most of the residents in Kentucky who signed up to fight in the war signed up and fought in the Confederacy. And so did Charlotte's father. He went off to war in 1861 and he was immediately killed. Now, right here at age 17, that's when Charlotte's life took I could say a nosedive, but she didn't let it take a nosedive, but it did take a very hard turn for her. She all of a sudden had all the responsibility on her shoulders, and her mother and some of the relatives pooled their resources together, money, gave her money, and shipped her up to Detroit, Michigan to live with some relatives and to enter the social, like the debutante season, all the social parties, everything, so that with the express purpose of finding a rich husband who could then support her and her mother and her sister and the plantation and everything. So she was up in Detroit. This would have been while the Civil War was going on. She loved it. She loved dressing up beautifully. She loved the party. She loved to dance. She thoroughly enjoyed her time. Her money began to run out. She didn't have a rich husband. So at that time, one of the jockeys that she'd become friends with, whose name was Johnny Golden, followed her up to Detroit. And he convinced her, he was a gambler also, and he convinced her to join him on the riverboats on the Ohio and the Mississippi River and to gamble. And that was a way that she would be able to survive. So she did. She joined him. And of course, she had Mary Poindexter with her to protect her and to have her back, so to speak. But she did. She made money in order to send it home. Her mother at this point, a little later on in the Civil War, ended up in a wheelchair. Her sister, she wanted to make sure that she would be highly educated. So she had a lot of reason for making money besides just keeping herself afloat too. So, but she never, ever let her family, relatives, anybody know that that's how she was making all the money that she sent home to support her family. I don't know what name she used, but she didn't use Tompkins. She didn't use the last name Tompkins. And it said that she never returned home either. She never saw any of her relatives again. The one thing she maintained through all of this was her very genteel Southern upbringing. She dressed impeccably, beautifully. She had manners out the kazoo. She did not allow any cussing, drinking, or smoking at a gambling table that she might be running. And it was said that Mary Poindexter always sat behind her in a chair a little higher up to watch all the other gamblers and make sure that everything was on the up and up. So she was very strict, kept very much to herself the whole time, because it was a really rough life. And of course, I can't help but think of Rhett Butler, and Gone with the Wind. And, I don't know if that's what it was really like, but it really was a rough life. However, it kept them all out of the battleground areas, and that was good. But finally, she decided that was enough, and she wanted to go ahead and get down to New Orleans. So she said goodbye to Johnny Golden and said, he said, I'll meet you down in San Antonio at some point. And she got off the boats. There's not much written about this, but she had a very harrowing trip overland down to New Orleans. She saw a lot of burned out plantations, and she, of course, had to stay off the roads because she didn't want any soldiers to see her and Mary. But she finally made it down to New Orleans, and she did what she what she learned to do every time she moved around. She found a boarding house to live in or a small house to rent for her and Mary. But in New Orleans, she felt comfortable. She'd been there before. She knew the territory. She knew some of the upper class people. So she spent the rest of her time up to the end of the Civil War, a couple of years in New Orleans, gambling with the upper classes and filling her trunks with the finest of Parisian fashions before she then decided to head west. At the end of the Civil War, apparently there really were signs that said, head west, young man. All the opportunities, the ranching opportunities and everything were out that direction. They were building forts, pardon me, they were setting up forts to protect the settlers and the ranchers from the Indians. So it was a very good time for people to go west. So in 1865, she was 21 years old. That's just how old she was. She headed west and headed to San Antonio. San Antonio at that time had a population of over 10,000 people. It was bustling, and it was an extremely lucrative place to gamble because there was so much money flowing in that area with all the ranchers and folks. So she traveled there to San Antonio, and she ended up living in San Antonio for 5 years, from age 21 to age 26. She loved it. She ended up gambling in a lot of prominent gambling clubs. She joined the wealthy class and was accepted. She bought a beautiful home and was able to build friendships in the wealthy class and was very much included, even though she was a single working woman. So San Antonio were good years. She never, as I said, she never used her last name of Tompkins to prevent anybody that may be from Kentucky back home from putting two and two together and figuring out who she was. She ended up landing a job at a very prestigious club, gambling club called the University Club for the upper classes that was owned by three brothers named Thurman. And the Thurman brothers were raised in a very upper class genteel family in Georgia. They all enlisted in the Civil War. They all managed to survive, and they ended up together in San Antonio and opened this. They were the tri-owners of this university club where Charlotte worked. Charlotte ended up falling in love with Frank Thurman, who was the oldest of the three brothers. And Frank Thurman was half Cherokee. His mother had been Cherokee. And so he had learned a lot of skills of how to take care of himself. He also was an excellent gambler. And so she was there for 5 years, but prior to leaving, Frank was in an altercation with another man and ended up killing him due to self-defense. And he got off. The law, said that's fine. Said, yep, it was self-defense. But the family were not happy about that, of the victim. And so Frank left and headed west to New Mexico. Let me get you, let's see. I think I've got another picture here of this. Oh, this is the proper Charlotte. I'm sorry, I forgot to show you the proper Charlotte. This is what she would have looked like probably right when the Civil War started and when she was up in Detroit going through parties and everything. Okay, and I put this map in here just in case. It's very familiar, obviously, to me. But if you're not a Texan and you've never been to Texas, and I don't know who all is joining us today, it will help you to see, perhaps, if you're not familiar with a lot of the demographics of Texas. Of course, San Antonio, here's Austin, obviously. San Antonio is just almost, well, it's due a little southwest of Austin, right about here. So she was in San Antonio for those 5 years. And then when, well, I'll back up a minute and say in San Antonio, while she was there, she and Mary Poindexter went there, they split and went their own ways. At that point, Mary Poindexter was free. And she had become friends with another class, a whole class of freedmen and free women. And she got into a group of freed women who were literally taking in all the orphan children, but they were also teaching the orphan children how to steal, how to pickpocket and steal, kind of an Oliver story. And so that's what Mary Poindexter went. She went her way, and that's all that we know of Mary Poindexter. So when Frank had to leave San Antonio, he went west, and they kept in touch by some letters, but she never knew quite where he was. He was on the move the whole time. So she finally packed up and left San Antonio to follow him, to find him. And she traveled for 2 years to several locations. She went out to Fort Concho and out to San Angelo and up to right about where you see this yellow, that's Fort Worth. She was up in the Fort Worth area, all around there. She ended up after 2 years. At this point, she's 26 to 28 years old. And everywhere she went, she gambled to keep herself going and to send money back home, kept her very stylish, very Southern genteel behavior, very good boundaries, did not get in trouble, did not carouse, none of that, didn't cuss, never drank, never smoked, all of those things. She very much lived her, what she was, what she had been raised to be those first years of life. Eventually, in 1872, when she was 28, she ended up in Fort Griffin. This is Fort Griffin right here. And that's how I know about Charlotte, because Fort Griffin is just 15 miles from the little tiny town of 2,000 called Albany, Texas, where my mom grew up. And that's how I know about Charlotte. When she got to Fort Griffin, let's see, let me give you a picture of her. When she got to Fort Griffin, that's what she looked like. And at Fort Griffin, she took the name Lottie Dino. And that's the person I knew about first, was Lottie Dino, who was well known to be this very respectable, just exactly everything I've been talking about, upper class female gambler. The name apparently came from some man who she won a lot of money off of, and he went, boy, that's a lot of dinero that she won. And so it just got shortened to Lottie Dino. I guess they just started calling her that somewhere. So at any rate, the Fort Griffin years, the years that she was in Fort Griffin, she was Lottie Dino. So I want to take just a minute and give you a tiny bit of history and tell you about Fort Griffin. Let's see if I've got a map, the next map here. There we go. This is a map, literally right here. All of this is called Government Hill, and this is actually the Army Fort Griffin. Down below is the town of Fort Griffin, but it was called the Flat, because it was on a flat piece of land, kind of on the floodplain of the Clear Fork portion of the Brazos River. So it built up virtually because there were so many people around the area, and the settlers, of course, there were settlers. And this was the time Fort Griffin, along with a lot of other forts, were set up out west to protect the settlers from the Kiowa and the Comanche Indians. And it was set up in 67, 2 years after the Civil War. So consequently, the little town grew up underneath it. And that is where Lottie showed up and found Frank Thurman. He was actually bartending at a saloon called the Beehive Saloon. And he was going under the name of Mike Fogarty. And so at any rate, Lottie did what she always did. She stepped off the stage looking like $1 million fresh out of Paris, Nobody touched her. She immediately went and rented a small adobe house kind of out here on the outskirts of Fort Griffin. And they said that nobody ever saw anybody go in or out of her little house. And her style or her normal routine of living or of life was that she went to work at 9 p.m. every night. She went and she became a house gambler at the Beehive Saloon, very famous. She's very famous in this area for gambling at the Beehive Saloon. She had a room in the back. She, again, never allowed any drinking, cussing, smoking, cheating, anything. She was very, very, she was very intimidating, actually. Nobody ever touched her. And she and Frank Thurman, who was Mike Fogarty there, they just acted like they had casually met each other. They did not let anybody know that they had known each other or that they were in love, which they were, because he was still being chased by folks that wanted to kill him, and she, didn't want anybody to ever know who she was. So they just kind of were there together, but they didn't ever appear much together at all. A little bit about Fort Griffin, or the Flat, it was called. It was perhaps the roughest place in West Texas that anybody could land or be in. The population there rose to about 1,000. It was a hugely busy place because at this time there were large amounts of buffalo and bison out. And so there were a huge amount of buffalo hunters and skinners, and buffalo skins were, there was a lot of money flowing due to that and due to ranching and a lot that was going on out there. It was a very lucrative place for people, obviously, to gamble. It was full of soldiers. There were some of the buffalo soldiers were at Fort Griffin. And so it was a place where a lot of the soldiers obviously went down to. It was also, though, full of merchants and their families, and cattlemen and their families. And of course, the lawless renegades, the professional gamblers, the prostitutes, the buffalo hunters and skinners, and there actually was a sheriff. There were lots of stores and businesses. There was even a newspaper office that put out the Fort Griffin Echo. There was an academy, a small academy, i.e. school. There was a Masonic lodge, a hotel, a blacksmith, a bootmaker. It was a stagecoach stop for the Butterfield stage. They had a doctor. They had dance halls and saloons. Most importantly, it was part of the Great Western Trail for moving cattle up to Dodge City. And they said at one point it even rivaled Fort Worth, Texas for that. So there was a lot of action going on and a lot of lawlessness. They even had, I think I've got a picture of it here. They even had a jail. This is a little tiny building. And just let's see, I wanted to read you just one little tiny thing. During this period of lawlessness, which was common in the town, citizens built this thick-walled jail in 1878. Gamblers, buffalo hunters, and skinners were frequently held here. As many as 18 at one time were in this little tiny building. So you can see here it is right here. And this is partially a recreation of Fort Griffin, which is now on the historic register, and it's actually a park that you can go see. But at any rate, Lottie Dino lived a very secluded life there. She was shunned terribly by all of who would have been my ancestors, by the way. all the respectable settlers in the area who eventually managed to get the Texas legislature to form a new county called Shackleford County and made Albany the county seat. And eventually Albany got the railroad through there. So that was one of the reasons Fort Griffin, besides the Army fort eventually closing down, Fort Griffin hung on the flat, hung on for a little while. Even the school at the flat and the Albany schools were combined for a little while, being 15 miles apart. But it eventually died just due to all of those things. Even though she was shunned by the settlers, a lot of the settlers, she had one very good friend who was an army an army officer's wife, who she spent, that was just her one girlfriend that she spent time with. And they would go out and travel and take day trips. And, and they said that one of the trips that they took together was to Jacksboro, Texas. And there she met a really nice person, a dentist. She needed a dentist. And she met this dentist whose name was John Henry Holliday. And she ended up becoming good friends with him. And he ended up moving to Fort Griffin and becoming real good friends with Frank Thurman. And that, of course, was Doc Holliday. And some of his good friends, Fort Griffin, everybody went through Fort Griffin. Wyatt Earp, all of the names we all hear about from the cowboy movie, the Westerns, all of them passed through Fort Griffin. So Frank also was busy working out on cattle trail rides and riding shotgun on the stagecoach quite a bit. But eventually, he also had another altercation in town and had to leave. But he was ready to leave anyway. He was ready to head to New Mexico because New Mexico became a real mining boom area in Kingston and Silver City. The mining just exploded out there. So there was a lot of opportunity out in New Mexico. So he headed that direction. And she stayed in Fort Griffin for a little while. And then a year later, she quietly slipped out of Fort Griffin, and nobody knew she had left. And she had paid a couple of months ahead on her living quarters that nobody had ever been inside of. And it turned out that when they did go inside, this is the only thing she took with her when she left Fort Griffin. This is a leather trunk, and I show it to you because it still exists today in a museum in Bandera, Texas, which I'm curious to go. I'm going to get on the road and go see it sometime. But at any rate, she bought it from the sheriff because it had been made in Kentucky, and it really meant a lot to her. So she begged the sheriff to sell it to her, and he did. So that is the only thing she left with out of Fort Griffin. And when they finally decided she wasn't there, and the sheriff and a couple of people they finally just, I guess broke down the door or whatever and went into to her home, what they discovered was she had this little tiny, very lavishly furnished home there in Fort Griffin with very elegant surroundings. But she had left a note on her pillow that said, "Sell this outfit and give the money to someone in need of assistance." And this is really important to tell you about her because one of the things that was very strong about her was that she was extremely compassionate. She worked very hard to help any of the young prostitutes. A lot of them were Civil War widows who had no way to survive and went west. She worked very hard to help any of them get off the street, so to speak. She was noted as being very compassionate and very, very generous with her money. When anybody needed help, she would pay for funerals if people couldn't pay for a burial, all sorts of things like that, but very quietly. did those things. So that was not unusual for her to have left a note to sell everything and give it to whoever needed it. She was very compassionate. As I said, she had fallen in love with Frank Thurman almost 15 years earlier, and she followed him to New Mexico. Let's see how we're doing on time. I better speed up here. Here's a picture of Frank Thurman, just so you can see what he looks like. And here again, I know very little about New Mexico, except the few places I've been, but if this helps any folks that haven't, here's the tip of Texas, El Paso, the little tiny far western tip. He traveled up to Kingston. You can see my arrow. Kingston is right here. And he traveled up there and she followed him. And they opened a gambling, they both wanted to quit gambling, but they opened a gambling room behind in a hotel to build up some funds. And eventually they both moved straight across here to Silver City, which you can see a lot better there. Silver City, which was a huge mining area. So Frank got into mining, he got into land. Lottie bought, I think she was going by Charlotte, probably again at that point, Charlotte. She bought a restaurant, the Broadway restaurant, and had a gambling room in the back. So when they both had the goal of to stop gambling and to live. They both wanted to go back to their roots and live a respectable life. So eventually they married in Silver City in 1880. And Charlotte would have been 36. She was 36 years old when so she went from age 17 to age 36. That's about 19 years or whatever, living a pretty rough existence, still sending money home, just trying to keep herself afloat, but maintained her comportment, I guess, for lack of a better word, her morals and values and ethics and her manners, all of that. So after they married, this is when life finally became redeeming. They ended up moving to Deming, right down here on Interstate 10 now. No interstate at that point, but they moved down here to Deming. And Frank, she was, let me get a picture of her. There she is, Mrs. Frank Thurman. She loved going by Mrs. Frank Thurman. He built her a house, bought a really choice lot in town and built her, that's their home, built her a beautiful home, and which they lived in together, although Frank, at this point, he was a miner. He was dealt in land, real estate. He had bought a ranch, and so he loved being out on the ranch. So he'd be home and she'd fix him breakfast every morning and he'd head out for the ranch. They did not have any children. But when they moved to Deming, the first thing she did after they got the house built and moved in is, being a cradle Episcopalian, Charlotte immediately joined a group of Episcopalians who were just gathering in a home at that point. And then 2 years later, in 1884, St. Luke's Missionary Church was one of Deming's earliest established missions. The pastor was Reverend Dunlop. I didn't research him, but he was the missionary bishop for a really large district, including Arizona and the Indian Territory. Let me get you a picture of. Here's a picture of what St. Luke's Church does not look like today, but the very first building. And Lottie and Frank were known to be, as I said, extremely generous. When they moved to Deming, they quit gambling. He, of course, stayed into mining and into land and eventually became the vice president of the bank there. But they were known as an extremely generous couple. And so they paid for most of the building of the first St. Luke's Episcopal Church. She was considered a founding member of the church and helped set up the Sunday school system and even taught Hebrew. If you can imagine that, out in a little town in New Mexico, but very much loved getting back to her her church roots and respectability, which was very, very important to her. Frank, he wasn't really much of a church goer, but he did join the Odd Fellows, which is a fraternal organization dedicated to serving your fellow man. I kind of think this may have been an Odd Fellows, maybe wedding or ceremony or something. I don't really know what's going on there. It'd be interesting to know. But at any rate, they were known in the town as Uncle Frank and Aunt Charlotte. And they have done oral histories, which these folks would be deceased now, but they luckily got some oral histories from individuals who were children at the time that Frank and Charlotte moved to Deming, and had tremendous memories of them. Charlotte and Frank were so beloved by all the children, and they loved children. They were always available to any child, to be there, to listen, to help, whatever they needed. They said that Charlotte usually was the only audience member for all the children's little plays that they would design and then need an audience to put on. Charlotte was always their audience. She also oftentimes, well, all the time, she was a main parishioner that was part of the funeral processions for all the birds and animals that died that the children wanted to process and bury in the ground. She always made sure she helped out with the children with their little funeral services for birds and cats and dogs or whatever. So again, they were very beloved. But another thing that she did that was real important is that at this time there was still a huge amount of prejudice against Jews. And she, of course, had learned a lot about Judaism and could speak Hebrew from her Episcopal upbringing at the convent school. And there were 2 or 3 families in Deming that were Jewish, and she was determined to show compassion and to show people that these were human beings also. And one family became her very favorite family. It said that she didn't like her cooking at all. She probably never really learned to cook. And she would cook Frank breakfast and send him off. And then she would go out the back door over to a family, her favorite family, the Landauers. Here's a picture real quick of Lottie with Charlotte with a child. Very typical picture of her. There's several of pictures like that of her with children. Here's the Landauer family. This was a Jewish family, a very prominent Jewish family there in Deming. This is Charlotte right up here, top left. And she would go out her back door every morning, and the Landauers lived kind of back to back with her, and she'd go in their back door and eat breakfast with them every morning. They'd fix her a good breakfast. And it was said that a lot of times she'd eat lunch, she'd eat a noonday meal at somebody else's house and maybe dinner somewhere else. And they said she was very fun-loving, very compassionate, very generous, extremely generous. Loved being part of just a community where she was respected. And they said, she knew what it felt like to be ostracized. And she was determined that the Jewish families and the Landauers, being her favorite, would not be ostracized in Deming. So there you go. Let's see what else I can tell you about them. I think I've just about told you everything I've written here. Let me see. Next picture. Here's Charlotte. Picture her in the 1900s, early 1900s. She lived until 1934. She was almost 90 years old when she died. So she ended up living 52 years, the rest of her life in Deming, as a very prominent citizen. Frank died in 1908 when she was 64 years old. One of the other things she did for the community was in 1912, when she was 68, she helped with a few of her good friends in the community, several ladies. They formed a club called the Golden Gossip Club. This is Charlotte over here, of course. And this club started out as a sewing club, and then it became a club to just help people in the community. They also played bridge, and I can't even imagine what it would have been like to play bridge with Charlotte, i.e. Lottie Dino. She was probably extremely good at bridge. But at any rate, this club is still alive and well today, going today. And their motto was this, which I love: to tell the best things, to make the best of bad things, and to straighten mistakes. So that was their motto, the Golden Gossip Club. So she was very happy to have friends with high moral outlook, and all of this, of course, was extremely important to her. Very busy churchgoer. She also was real fun loving. You know, back when I told you in Detroit, when she was in the social scene and how much fun she had and loved, she was party person and loved to dance and do these things. So they said, I can only imagine, probably nothing that I could find written on it, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if she organized some really fun things in the church for the community, because everybody knew how fun loving she was. And it made me stop and think how all of that real person was tucked inside of her for all those years that she was Lottie Dino and had to support herself and her sister, and her mother did die along the way. So the last thing I really have on her is a picture, beautiful picture. This is an altar cloth that she made for St. Luke's Church, handmade. She made it when she was 83 years old. She gave it to the church in 1927. And I'm sure it was probably one of the skills, the needlework, that she learned as a Southern Belle, being raised with all those types of skills. So anyway, they have that today, the altar cloth. Frank and Charlotte are both buried in the Oddfellows section of the cemetery in Deming. The only reason I thought I would show you these pictures is because, and Frank's name is on the top, you can't really see it, but it says Frank right up here, and then Thurman and his age and probably his dates down here. But if you notice, Lottie had her requested that her headstone be put 1 foot behind Frank's to his left, because she said she always had his back. And so that's why she had her headstone put there. So that is the life of Lottie Dino, i.e. Charlotte Tompkins, i.e. finally Mrs. Frank Thurman. And so I think really most of her life was very, very happy. She just had those really, really tough years of surviving in a really tough world. But again, I met her first as Lottie Dino, and so I was stunned when I read, I'll show you, let's see if you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but I don't know if y'all can see it on the screen. This is the book I read on her, which has been extremely well researched. It's all fact in here. She's debunked a lot of the stories about Lottie Dino, but that's how I knew about Lottie Dino. And then when I read it and realized she was just this amazing Episcopalian who had helped start a church, I was kind of blown away by that. And one thing I will tell you, I don't think it's true. I could not find anything on it, but it actually is on the church website. They think there was a rumor apparently, but enough that the church isn't sure today, that $40,000 that Charlotte and Frank raised $40,000, which was a lot of money back then, to build the first church by hosting a big gambling game, which Doc Holliday showed up for because he had lost so much money to Lottie. And now, whether all that's true, I can't in a way imagine that it's true, because I wouldn't think she would want everybody to know what an ace of a gambler she was. But you never know. So, and it's on their website. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So there you go. That's really the end of the story. I have some other fun little facts, but they don't particularly have anything to do with her life. But I think she's a very good representation of how messy our lives can be and how God can still work through them to bring redemption. And I think she was a very interesting Episcopal woman. So thank you.
Well, Paula, I just really thank you so much. That was a most interesting presentation of a very colorful life. And gosh, I feel like my life is pretty boring compared to what she went through. But everybody to each its own. It was very interesting. We only have a couple of minutes. I don't know if anyone had a question or anything. I want to again ask you all to go to our website, ewhp.org, and see what we offer. We offer scholarships, grants. We give out awards. We will be having a big time this summer at General Convention. We're going to have a luncheon that you're all invited to come and be part of it. We want you to know that we want you to do what we are doing, and that is keep the history of women that you have heard of or know about that may be very unimportant to many people, but maybe they're unimportant because nobody knows about them yet. So go ahead and write it down, record it, whatever, and give it to us to share. We really want to share that. Well, since I didn't see any questions or comments. Last chance. Anybody? Next week, we are going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Kajawa Holbrook, who's going to talk about two famous women who are Christian educators, Adelaide Teague and Verna Dozier. So I hope that you will come back and listen to this. And as we told you before, these are on our YouTube channel, that anybody who didn't see it or wants to re-see it or use it for Christian education yourself, you're welcome to do that. Thank you for coming. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.